So this session, like I mentioned, we have Gabby Novacek from BCG, who's a partner and managing director. So with Gabby today, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of her career path, first of all, as an out LGBT person, but also really focus on what it's like to be out in, especially when you're dealing with external situations. So in her case, client, sometimes international pieces, because that was something that we talked about a lot this morning. So I guess if you're open to it, just introduce yourself.
Sure. So it's great to see you all. Welcome to Chicago. For those of you who are coming from elsewhere, you guys picked like the most perfect spring weekend ever to be here. So hopefully you'll get outside a little bit. As Matt mentioned, my name's Gabby. I'm a partner here at BCG in our Chicago office. I work primarily in our consumer goods practice area. So I work a lot with clients who manufacture food and beverage products in particular. And then I'm also a member of our marketing and sales practice area as well. So I do a lot of work around kind of brand transformation, marketing capabilities, and most recently a lot of work on digital and e-commerce as well. On the LGBT side, I head up our global LGBT network. So BCG has an LGBT organization that really stretches across the overwhelming majority of our 60 plus offices, and we are connected very, very tightly together as one kind of community of just sort of partnership, affiliation, and collaboration. And so we kind of engage as a leadership team across the world on a day-to-day basis, and I help to spearhead those efforts for us.
Excellent. Well, let's start with career.
Yep.
So she's not actually an MBA, so
I'm not.
preface with that.
You guys are all aliens to me, so it's
But you started kind of with a non-traditional career path going into consulting. Can you talk about kind of what that transition was like?
Sure. So prior to consulting, and I always like to tell people BCG was my first job, because it was. I was actually a PhD, so I went to the University of Chicago here on the South Side. And was an archaeologist. So I worked primarily in the Middle East on a time period known as the Early Bronze Age, which was about 5,000 years ago, and spent the better part of my early adulthood basically digging big holes in the ground, taking the things I found, sorting it into piles, doing analyses on it, and then publishing papers. Kind of got to a point as I was finishing up my dissertation where I just got really, really frustrated with the work I was doing. It felt really esoteric. It was one of those dissertations that I'm not even going to bore you with explaining what it is, but there were probably 4 people on the planet who actually understood what I was doing, and my wife was not one of those people. And so just started to get a little bit of wanderlust and a bit of a just itch to get out there and say, I've got this amazing capability to solve really complicated problems, to look at the world in a different way. There has to be something beyond sitting in the basement of an archaeology lab, sorting broken pottery into piles, or teaching the same introductory lectures over and over again. And, ended up having a really fortuitous conversation with a former college roommate who is now a partner at another firm that starts with M, but we won't speak of them here. And, she said to me, she was like, you're itching to get out there. You want to go do something that has more impact, that lets you keep learning, that lets you keep taking that set of problem-solving skills you've built and extend them out. Have you thought about consulting? And my first reaction was, well, that would be selling out to the man. But my second reaction was, well, that's actually really interesting to think about, because it had never occurred to me that there was this industry that would hire me without an MBA, and that I could actually bridge that transition into the consulting world, really learn a lot about business, and if I liked it, stay, and if I didn't like it, I now had this amazing thing on my resume that I could go out and conquer the business world more broadly. And so made a go at it, decided to go to BCG. The first 6 months were terrifying, disorienting, probably the most difficult sort of set of 6 months I'd had in my career, absent of, or kind of excluding the week that I defended my dissertation. So it was just a very, very new world to operate within. But the thing that made the difference really, really early on, and I say it with real honesty, it was the very first day I arrived at BCG and I got my laptop and I checked my email for the first time. There was this email from the head of the LGBT network, this guy named Scott Davis. And it was this really warm letter of introduction and welcome, and we're so excited to have you here. And it was a portal that then introduced me to this network of people that stretched around the world, that came from a similar life story as me, who had similar questions about how to be a business person as I did. And really, really quickly, actually had a chance to start to connect with this group of people around the world. And it was pretty amazing because it was still hard to learn how to be a business person, but from day one, that very first project I did, there was somebody else from the network who I had something in common with and connect with on the first day. You know, that very first business trip I had to take was to New York, and I walked into the New York office, and there were all these names on the doors of people I had seen, and I could walk in and say hi because that bridge had already been crossed. And so, you know, it was this way that I was able to really quickly build a family within the company, and that made all the difference in the world. Because yeah, I had to learn how to create a spreadsheet and an Excel model and do all of that. But I knew that I had this group of people there that was really watching out for me and helping me kind of make it through that transitionary period. And that was really the special sauce that made it work.
So, I mean, what would you advise? Because not everyone in here is going into consulting, but they're all, for the most part, probably going to companies that have some sort of support structure. What's the best way to take advantage of that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways to do it. I mean, the number one is do not be shy to raise your hand and announce who you are and get connected on the very, very first day of your employment. Because the reality is there are very few organizations that any of you will ever consider working for that don't look at their diversity of their workforce and say, this absolutely has to be a number one priority for us because we are all in a war for talent and we need to bring the best and the brightest into our organizations. Those people need to come from a diversity of thought, experience, and background. And more importantly, once they're actually here, we need to support them at every single step along their career path. And so it's really important, day one, get connected. It's going to help you build a social network, but it's also going to help plug you into a whole realm of incremental support, mentoring, coaching that is really, really valuable kind of all the way across your career. You know, I think the second thing that I would say is get connected, and then as soon as you're comfortable in your new job, get involved. Because beyond just the simple fact that you're contributing something back to an LGBT community, a lot of times these organizations give you a really interesting, unique, and safe space to test and build new business skills. So, like if I think about our own network, we take really, really junior consultants on our team and we put them in positions like managing our recruiting efforts across North America. And what does that do? It puts you in charge of a big project with a lot of stakeholders, with access to really senior people within the company, with opportunities to practice things like speaking in front of a group or helping drive strategy or having to influence. And it's all these things that help build kind of your collective skill set as professionals. Forget that you're LGBT, but just as business professionals, and you've got these amazing sets of opportunities that get presented to you that happen because you're part of this cohort, and you really should take advantage of them. So if I think about myself, you know, I kind of started out in the network, got really involved in recruiting on day one, became our recruiting director, kind of ultimately became the leader in North America and then globally. Really, really great. You get to feel like you're driving impact. You get to be influential. But I still remember the day I got elected partner at BCG, every single member of our executive committee, who's our global leadership group, called me personally to congratulate me. And they did that because they knew who I was. And they had seen me speak, and they had seen me present, and they had seen the things that I had been doing as a part of the network. And they saw me as part of BCG's leadership even before I was. And that's been just hugely, hugely valuable. So I think that's the other piece of it. It's get connected and take advantage of the connection, but really take advantage of the opportunities that these organizations and these networks have to give you exposure to people and to business skills that you wouldn't necessarily get a chance to do so early in your career.
So you're talking about involvement. I know one of the questions that often comes up from people is, I'm going into a company, I know they have an ERG, I don't know how to let them know I'm interested. I don't even know what to volunteer myself for. Like, what advice would you give to somebody who's going into that situation?
Yeah, so there's two ways you get involved, right? So number one, every company in the world today has some sort of internal website. Type in diversity or LGBT, I will absolutely guarantee you somebody is going to pop up as the contact person, and when you send them an email, there will be a flood of love and outreach that's going to come. It almost gets embarrassing sometimes. So that's a really, really easy way to do it. You know, the other thing that I would just say, like there's always this pivotal moment that happens kind of when you're first signing on, you know. And so for me, it was the day I had to fill out my HR paperwork on my very first day at BCG. And like, that's the time to raise your hand. And if you have a partner, say, how do I make sure that I'm setting up my benefits in the right way to support that partner? Or, you know, most companies will have, like, they list spouses or significant others for, you know, when they have events and things like that, saying, listen, this is my significant other, this is my partner, this is my husband, this is my wife. Being really open and transparent about it on day one gets you comfortable doing it. It also gets it out there in a really open way too. And then it's just not a question, right? You know, so the first time that holiday party rolls around, the invitation comes and you're both on it, and it's just a done deal. And it's very, very easy that way.
So one of the things we talked a little bit about this morning with clubs, which I think applies to the workplace too, is about engagement, both amongst internal LGBT folks, but also allies. How do you handle that as somebody who's kind of overseeing a whole ERG?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So we've had an interesting path and history with ally engagement in particular within our organization. You know, I think very early on, you know, to be perfectly honest and transparent, we were very opposed to allies being involved in our ERG at all. You know, the way we looked at it, it was, here was a group of people that had historically in the workplace been marginalized, who were now finally getting an opportunity to step forward, to have people recognize that, listen, we need to make sure that there is full and total equality, that our value system is aligned with how we treat each other day to day, and that we're providing the support that this cohort needs to be successful in the workplace. And if allies start to get involved, it dilutes that. And that was very, very much the attitude that we took early on. There has been a real sea change in the last even just 12 to 18 months as we've thought about ally engagement. And where it has really come from has been to say, it's fantastic that you come to an office like Chicago or New York or San Francisco. And like in our New York office last year, our incoming class was something like 22% LGBT. I mean, it's just crazy, right? So you look at that and you say, of course, it's great to be in those offices and be out, and you've got a community and everything else. But what happens when you're in Sao Paulo, Brazil? And you're the one 21-year-old who's fresh out of college and you don't have a community there. And you want to build it and you want to be out and you want to be open, but how do you actually do that in a way that you feel safe and supported? And that's really where we've stepped forward and said our allies play a really important role. Because what they do is they help to drive an overall office culture. They help to embed it within the leadership of our organization, and they make it part of the day-to-day fabric of how we operate, how we think. I mean, everything right down to the way that we're organizing special office events to make sure that they're inclusive, the way that we call things to the carpet when somebody's using language that's offensive or not inclusive. Right down to, you know, that brand new consultant doesn't quite know what they should say or how they should behave at the client, and they don't have somebody there locally to help them through that transition period. Those allies serve a really important role in being that person who can be the advocate, the support, and that connection point. And so, you know, over the last year or two, we've really stepped up and said, starting first with our offices where we didn't have strong representation, there was a real gap, and we started to really recruit allies to kind of play that role. And now it's been kind of taking on a life of its own, and it's been extending quite a bit more broadly. And it's creating some tension, because you look and you say, all right, well, you know, our allies are really involved day to day. Does that mean that they come to the special events for the LGBTers, or they kind of take advantage of those resources? And we're still trying to figure a lot of that out, to be really honest. But, you know, I think the important progress we've made is to say engagement needs to be engagement for BCG as a whole, and it can't just be us as a cohort, because we risk being very siloed and we risk siloing ourselves. And so we have to engage those allies, and let's figure out the way that we do it in a way that's going to be productive, successful, and empowering for all of us. And I think we're still very much on that journey and sorting it out, but we've made a lot of progress in the last year or so.
Do you guys do anything internally? So, you know, one of the problems that we know exists within this community is out LBT women, and so typically they are only about 25 to 30% of any given class. Are you guys doing anything to kind of look at intersections of diversity? So if we're talking about the LGBT community and women, the LGBT community and different ethnicities, kind of how are you dealing with some of this what seems to be an increasingly important intersection point?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's interesting because I think we've done it ad hoc for a while and not gotten very far, to be perfectly honest. And I think the net impact has been, so somebody like me, goes to our Women's Initiative events and feels completely like a fish out of water, because it's like we're talking about a lot of stuff that doesn't relate in any way, shape, or form to the life that I'm living, and it's been hard. I think the big move that we've made very recently as a company is, I think until very recently, we treated each of our diversity cohorts as kind of standalone islands. And so we had an LGBT network, we had a Hispanic network, we had an African American network, we had a women's initiative. Each of them operated very independently with a partner leading them. And occasionally we'd talk, but it was more because the leaders of a lot of those were all in the Chicago office and would have coffee chat, right? Several months ago, we actually hired within BCG a diversity and inclusion leader whose job is very much to try to figure out how we best stitch together those organizations, recognizing, I think, Matt, exactly as you're saying, there are a lot of intersection points that happen, because we do have people that are members of multiple cohorts, and how do you find a way to ensure that the kind of complete picture of their needs is being met, and not, today I'm LGBT because I'm at the conference, and next week I'm a woman because I have to go to this women's dinner, and a week after that I'm at the special dinner for people with weird backgrounds academically, and somehow these things all have to link together. And so our new diversity and inclusion leader is very much, as he thinks about what his primary role is to figure out exactly how we bridge those intersection points. It gets hard, right? Because there's not many of us. So we, if we bring together the LGBT women, we could have one table at a restaurant, right? And so so how you actually create scale is tricky, but it's very much sort of that next step that we're trying to sort through, because there's got to be a better way to link together. And the way that we've started it is to think around thematically topics of mentorship, retention, career development, things that you could say, how I'm impacted by those things is me as a complete individual, and it's the profile of me across all of my dimensions that we figure out how you support me in those spaces, versus I need to solve for you're a woman and therefore you might have children, and that brings complexity to the workplace. And so what are the themes that stretch across all of our dimensions? I think what's been interesting about that is that then you start with the diversity cohorts, but it extends to BCG more broadly, and it's very much this notion of the cohort of one, and saying we've hired each year however many hundred individual snowflakes, and each of you is special, and how do we figure out kind of the profile of who you are and support you through the range of various contact points that we can have. But it's very much where we're heading next.
Yeah, and I mean, how many of you guys with your organizations work with other diversity groups on campus? Yeah, so
Yeah.
for them, it's definitely top of mind.
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
So I guess let's get personal.
Uh-oh.
Let's talk about kind of from your own experiences. One of the things that's come up a lot today is when you're dealing with external parties who may not be as supportive, and in particular in international situations, how do you navigate, both in your case, both being LGBT but also a woman?
It's interesting. So I think there's two elements. One is, if you are a talented business professional who is an asset to your firm, you can always say no. And recognizing that is step number one. So, we have, as you can imagine, just a really broad network of clients that we work with every single day across a really broad range of industries. And with that comes a whole just slew of different type of people that you might interact with. And, I think one of the really important things is whether there's an external interaction that's going to come about that makes you feel uncomfortable because you feel like I might walk into an environment that's not going to be tolerant of me as an LGBT person, or if it's something else that might make you feel uncomfortable, you should feel empowered to say no. So in my particular circumstance, I was asked directly by a client to go and spend 6 months in Saudi Arabia to help them enter that market. And it is one of BCG's 2 or 3 largest consumer goods clients in the world. somebody that we do about $30 million a year in business with. It was a direct ask from the CEO that I would be the person that would go to Saudi Arabia to do that work. And I said no. And, you know, it was very much an honest and open conversation to say, I fully respect and appreciate and am honored by the fact that you think that I'm the person who is best positioned to do this. But I don't feel comfortable spending 6 months in a country where I can't call my wife. I can't write her an email because I don't know what's going to happen to my email when it heads over the systems. I can't leave the country without a man to accompany me or give me permission to do that. I don't feel safe in that context and environment, and I said no. And I was so terrified to make that choice and that decision because I was like, oh God, what are the repercussions of this going to be? But it was interesting because our CCO, so our senior manager who basically owns that client relationship, basically stepped up and said, I can't believe we even asked you to do this. You know, this is not acceptable. I'm so sorry. I hope you don't feel compromised at all. Please know that we have your back. The client CEO had the exact same reaction, you know, and so I think it's one of those things where we often feel compelled to put ourselves into situations, and when others recognize why it might not be a safe space for us, they immediately recognize that and they give you the latitude that you need. So I think number one is to feel confident saying no. I think number two is to recognize that, you know, for the most part, like there are very few people in this world who are, and I shouldn't say very few because there are entire nations that are, but for the most part when you interact in business, people want to do the right thing, right? And so not everybody comes from the same experiences, backgrounds, they haven't had the same exposure to different types of people and different types of contexts. And so they will say things and they will behave in ways and they will make comments and they will have biases that are a reflection of the world in which they've existed. When they are kind of given visibility to how those behaviors are impacting others, they are often horrified, mortified, and want to understand how to do the right thing. And so you recognize that there are very few people you will interact with in business that are genuinely trying to be malicious. And if anything, you know, the interactions that you have with them can often be a really, really powerful experience. And so, you know, one of the stories I love to tell, we have a gentleman in our group who some of you know, a guy by the name of Joe Pietro. Joe is very, very outwardly gay. I mean, he's somebody who wears it on his sleeve. We had him in a client situation where he was working with a fundamentalist Mormon for several months. And it was really interesting because the first few times these guys interacted, you could tell that his client counterpart wanted so badly to ask him questions, you know, and it had nothing to do with, I'm going to judge you, I disapprove of you, but it was more, I've never worked with somebody like you and I want to understand more. And it was funny because Joe finally one day stepped forward and said to him, you know, I'd love to talk about this and you know, let's go out to dinner. And they went out to dinner and they chatted and Joe told them all about, you know, his partner and his kind of career path and how he's dealt with being an out gay man in the business world. These two are now two of the closest friends you could possibly imagine in this world. And it's a friendship that's been born of something that you should look at that and say, oh my God, this is like basically a TLC, you know, reality special waiting to happen. But you know, this client like wasn't judging Joe or didn't like look at Joe and say, I hate you because you're gay and, you know, my church tells me I'm supposed to disapprove of you. It was very much, you're just unlike anything I've ever known. And once he had a chance to get to know him and really understand where he was coming from, he was actually more than anything else just wanted to understand, you know, how do I operate in a world where somebody like you is my friend because I've never had that opportunity before. And I think, you know, remembering that is really important because we will all come into contact with external parties who you'd say, oh my God, this guy is going to have all sorts of biases and hate me and everything else. And the overwhelming majority of people in this world want to do the right thing and they just don't know how. And when you recognize that and are open to it, often the most amazing bonds can form.
I guess kind of going on the flip side, so for somebody who might be international, we were talking about this in the hall, international who might be LGBT but maybe in a less friendly country, or a country where culturally it's just a little taboo but it's not illegal, how do you deal with them? How do you get them through their own personal journeys? Because I'm sure you kind of mentor them to some extent.
Yeah. So, the important thing that we've done is we've basically said, absolutely, you go and you work in India or Moscow or wherever it might be, there's going to be an external world that's going to feel very different. And the important thing is that no matter which of our offices you're in and which of our teams you're working on, you should feel that there is a consistent BCG experience that you're having around the world, no matter where you are. And so it's a little bit less of a direct, how do I mentor you as somebody who's in that environment, but a little bit more of the background work has been to say, one of the key roles that we as a network can play is to basically help in BCG's pursuit of creating that common culture, to basically take our leadership team, extend around the world, meet with office leads, take those allies, and really ensure that no matter what office you might be sitting in, you know that when you're inside our walls, everything is going to be safe and okay. And then together with that, then actually comes the coaching to say, all right, you're going to be in country X, but you need to understand that your project manager and your office head, these are allies to you. And it's very much a coaching process to say, let's outreach early, let's connect you early if you need me or another one of the leaders in the room, but let's build that relationship quickly and strongly so that you feel that you've got people who are part of your team very, very early on in that process. Because that's the factor we can control, right? Like I can't control that Putin passes some sort of absurd law in Russia tomorrow. But what I can control is that if you're a consultant in our Moscow office, you're deeply connected to the office head, to your project managers, to your career development advisor. They're completely aware and supportive of you and the context in which you live. And if anything ever happens, they're ready to act on your behalf instantaneously. And it's been a very successful strategy. Would we love to be able to kind of change the external environment? Absolutely. It's hard to do that though. And so in the near term, the most important thing is to just consolidate that we've got that support internally and we make sure that happens. And the practical outcome of that has been we've had consultants who've worked in countries where the legal environment has turned toxic overnight and their office head reaches out to them right away and says, are you comfortable what's happening? We had this in Russia not so long ago, and we had a consultant say, I don't think I can be comfortable living here anymore, and we were able to facilitate a transfer to the United States within a week. And and we have to be able to do that. And that's one of the key roles that a network like ours can play. It's kind of much like I was saying about people don't know what they don't know and they want to be able to do the right thing. Making sure that office leadership is really, really aware, embedded, and connected, and that you as the junior consultant know that that's that place that you can go is the number one thing to make sure that safety happens.
Is there a hesitancy among, let's say there's somebody who's based out of Russia and that's their home office, to get involved with the LGBT internal group?
Yeah, so historically there was, right? And it's been one of the kind of really interesting trends, these crazy millennials, right? So one of the really interesting things we've actually seen over the last, since I've been at BCG is actually kind of when it really started, so call it, 8 to 10 years. It used to be real deep hesitancy. So if you went to Asia Pacific, we had nobody who was a member of the LGBT network 10 years ago. A lot of consultants there. The kind of probability math would tell you that there had to be somebody, but nobody was out in the open. And what's been interesting to see happen is what it's taken is kind of that one charismatic individual who steps forward. And it happens over and over again. So we had in Taipei a guy by the name of Kowloon who was that one individual as a junior consultant who stepped forward and said, I'm gay, I'm in this office, we need to make sure that the things my colleagues in the United States are telling me are happening here too. And it was almost like an avalanche came behind him. The second that he stepped forward and made himself visible and was very, very transparent about it, public about it, kind of answered the stupid questions that people had without any flinch whatsoever, then all of a sudden all these people started to come out of the woodwork because they had a role model and they had somebody that they could connect to, and really kind of help to build from versus having to be that first pioneer. And it's been interesting because we've seen that over and over again now. It's these pioneers pop up in places like Latin America or in India or in Africa, and as soon as they do, it's like the avalanche starts to come behind them. And it is a scary thing to be that first person that steps forward, but that's the thing that often prompts that next wave. And so now it's fascinating because if I look Asia Pacific, we had Kowloon the first year that I joined BCG, and now we have 40, 50 people. And that's not through hiring, right? Like a lot of that is from people just getting comfortable and stepping forward and becoming part of the conversation. And like really tactically, it's funny, 8 years ago, I still remember it was the first year I was involved in planning for our big global meeting that we had. And at that time, virtually every single member from Asia Pacific would come to the conference via a fake reason. So we created a fake training that they said that they were coming to, with a fake budget code and everything else, so that they could basically come to the United States for a meeting and nobody would know that that's what they were doing. Nobody's actually used that option in years because it's just become okay. And a lot of that has been because those first few path breakers really stepped forward and set the groundwork.
That's amazing. So I want to make sure that we open it up and you guys have the opportunity to ask questions because we're getting into the international topic that we were talking about this morning. So questions from anyone out there?
Can you talk to some of your specific initiatives that
Yeah, so there's a couple big ones that we're looking at right now. So one of them in particular, so the way the consulting industry tends to work, for those of you who aren't part of it, so there's, on the one side of the house, you have the client-facing consultants, and then there's usually a massive army of people who we call our business services team. I think as a lot of these groups have formed over the years, there's been a lot of focus on the consulting teams and not so much on business services. And so the consulting teams have historically been the ones who, because it's a lot of kind of create for yourself, they've been the ones to create all the programming and then in turn launch conferences because it's a heavy recruiting pull, because of the career development elements. It's just been a very consultant heavy organization. So one of the things that we're really deeply involved in right now is to say, we have however many thousands of consultants around the world. We have 5x that number in our internal business services team. What's the model that we create to much more broadly and much more significantly support those people? In particular, because they are less likely to be mobile and they're less likely to have those interactions and interconnections the way that we get them as consultants, because I'm in however many offices in any given week. And so that's kind of priority number one, is really figuring out what that support model looks like. And I think to your earlier question, Matt, we've been, that's where the interconnections across the different networks is really coming into play, because we're all trying to figure this out right now. And so as everybody is pioneering and testing ideas, we're trying to connect and learn from each other to see what that looks like. So that's kind of number one. Number two is on the ally front. We've made moves, but we're trying to sort out, all right, beyond what we're doing today in terms of reaching out to allies to help us kind of bridge the community gap in places where we don't have it. How do we extend that much, much more broadly? And I think that's still very early in its planning, but we're looking at a lot of analogs, frankly, from our clients, where I go and walk the halls at one of my primary clients, and they've had a huge campaign where every single ally has a little sticker on the window of their office, and like, what's actually underneath that, and what are those allies doing? Or had a great chat with the folks from IBM just this last week. They came and spoke to the Clinton Global Initiative about what they've been building, and so I had a chance to hear about that. And so kind of figuring out the ally picture is number two. And then number three is very much around kind of career development and retention. So one of the things that's really tricky about LGBT folks as a cohort, right? So It's changed recently, but historically this has been a group that is sort of less likely to be tied down to the suburban, split level home with 2.4 kids in a minivan in the driveway. And what that means practically for our industry is, when the economy gets really crazy, people tend to be really mobile. And so we have a hard time convincing LGBT professionals to stay with consulting long term and really make, a multi-decade career out of it, because they will be much more likely to be strong performers. It's actually fascinating. You guys perform really, really strongly as a cohort relative to others. And then when interesting job offers come, we'll jump at them because, you tend to be a little bit more sort of out of the box thinkers in terms of how you manage your life and your career and the opportunities that come before you. And so we're trying to figure out what that means. So how do we create a sustaining value proposition for consulting as a career for our LGBT professionals? And does that mean, opening up pathways to enter some of our other business lines? Like we have a digital ventures group, for example, that's doing all sorts of e-commerce innovation and things like that. And so what does that look like? And does that actually translate into kind of a broader BCG program that says, there's actually a kind of proliferation of potential career paths that we might not have considered before, that's sort of in service of driving longer term retention. So those are kind of the three big pieces right now.
Yep.
We've been approached by a potential client that has, an anti-LGBT stance, and how would you reconcile deciding to engage that client versus?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I have, it's a little tricky. So basically it was, I don't want to say that it's an anti-LGBT stance, because that's tough to pin down, but a little bit more of a kind of Fortune 500 company that is on record as not being particularly up to speed when it comes to LGBT rights and benefits, if that makes sense. So kind of one of the last holdouts anywhere in the world, in terms of partner benefits and that type of thing. I personally made an active choice not to be part of that client team. The way I treated it was very much like I also had, this one we turned down as a company as a whole, but we had a major tobacco manufacturer approach us not long ago, and they wanted to do a huge growth strategy, which would have been, if we'd done it, would have made my year. I could have basically done that thing and then taken Q4 off and gone skiing, which would have been awesome, by the way. But, basically looked at it and said, I can't personally feel good about myself at night if I know that I'm basically developing a strategy that says I need to find the next generation of cigarette smokers because all yours are dying off, right? And it was kind of the same logic. It was with this other company, and it actually would have been a kind of HR organization type piece of work. I was like, you want me to come and create an excellent organization for you, but in the context of a company that doesn't provide sort of basic equality to its staff. Like, that's not okay for me, and I chose not to participate. And I mean, it's a little bit of, there's obviously a bit of a first world problem there, right? When you have the choice to turn it down, it makes it easier, but that could have turned into a multi-year, very multi-million-dollar relationship. And I just said, it's again, I'm not going to feel good sleeping at night if I know that I'm supporting an organization like that, and I'm just not going to do it. And I kind of put that in the same bucket as companies that make things I don't support or hurt the environment or do all sorts of other things.
David?
On the flip side of that, what are things that you've seen other companies do that you admired and trying to incorporate into your own firm? And also, and if you do have any conversations with other leaders in LGBT groups?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So this piece that I was talking about with our allies, and really starting in markets where we've got gaps to kind of, instead of saying we're going to create the next generation of LGBT leaders from our LGBT members, but actually say I'm going to create them from kind of high profile leaders that are allies. We actually took that from Goldman. which I thought was interesting. I always looked at the investment banks as probably not the place to go to for inspiring ideas on diversity. Sorry if anyone's a former Goldman person here. But it was actually, it came from them, and it was in talking to them, and we'd had a lot, they had faced this issue in India in particular, and they had said, gosh, we've got such a huge team in India. We've got nobody who's a member of our LGBT ERG. There have to be people there, but how do we change the culture there so people feel welcome and open? And they started by finding a set of kind of high-profile emerging leaders who were LGBT friendly and bringing them in as allies to basically serve as the nodes in that market. And it was interesting because when they did that, it became the cool thing to do. And so it very rapidly expanded so that they went from having kind of 3 or 4 managerial allies who were helping to create sort of an inclusive environment to actually being virtually everybody on the management team there was basically a formal ally, because it almost became a career blocker to not be part of it because you weren't part of the cool group that had figured this out and was culturally enlightened. And so it was actually in listening to them and hearing their stories that we had very much adopted that and said that's something really, really exciting to do. I think the other organization that I found really interesting, I can't say who it is because it's one of my clients, but they have a huge base of operations in Texas, and I don't know if any of you guys are from Texas. Texas can be like India, so So it was really interesting because they brought in their chief HR officer was LGBT, but he basically created this really strong partnership with somebody who was their head of operations, and they said, we're going to take Gay Pride Week and we're going to blow it up in a massive way, and basically through kind of leveraging this big public event, take the culture of our organization forward like in rapid fire pace. And it was really, really fascinating because they grabbed on to Gay Pride Week. It gave them an excuse and launched this whole week of just huge like guest speakers coming in and kind of lunchtime forums and all this great stuff to just get people really immersed and engaging in LGBT topics. And the transformation that prompted was remarkable because all of a sudden, again, you had all these people that came out of the woodwork. You had a huge number of kind of management members that were stepping forward and said, I'm going to be a formal ally now to this community. And so you're kind of drawing from that similar thing as we've said, all right, so how do we also now say, it's Gay Pride Week and we've got offices where we don't have representation, but can we create stuff that might not be part of the day-to-day programming, but is actually a way to kind of get the topics front of mind and start to really increase visibility that way. And so that's been the other group that we've really pulled from.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear specifically about how you're thinking about the transgender community.
Yep.
And what you are hoping to achieve there, or maybe some of the challenges.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it's been interesting because to date, as I'm sure you guys know, there's just been a very small number of transgender students going through MBA programs, right? And so what we've been trying to do there is to say, we don't have an existing community, but how do we make sure that basically the ground is fertile and the kind of culture and the environment is there so that when the opportunity does come to hire a transgender employee, that they can come into the firm and know from day one that there will be, kind of as we say for everybody else in the LGBT cohort, that there is not a question that you are treated to the kind of fullest extent possible that we can possibly manage with kind of respect, support, and that any and all benefits needs are managed, and that basically our management team kind of understands sort of the needs of the transgender community. And so what we've been doing, part of it's been very much kind of a policy-oriented lens, as you can imagine. And so from a health insurance standpoint, we're self-insured. And so that gives us a lot of flexibility, which is great. And so we've been working really closely with the HRC to understand, what is, if you had kind of the Cadillac health insurance coverage for transgender health needs, what would that look like? And let's make sure that those are fully in place so that if and when the day comes, we are 100% ready and provide the absolute top standard of care that we can. And then much more from an internal cultural standpoint as well. So we started internally within the network about 2 years ago, starting to bring in external parties to help educate us to really understand everything from what's the language that we should be using, what are the issues that we're not even thinking about, but really helping us get up to speed. And we're now going to extend that out into basically a training program for our office management around the world. So the idea would be that it would be a half-day curriculum that the management team from each individual office participates in to make sure that they are basically fully immersed in understanding kind of what the issues, topics, concerns, and needs might be. Like I said, there hasn't been an opportunity yet, which has been actually a little bit frustrating, frankly. And I would love to see more members of the transgender community come through business school programs. But I think we're trying really hard to make sure that when the opportunity comes for somebody to join BCG, that we are 100% ready culturally and also from a policy standpoint as well.
Yeah.
Easy question related to that. So I just wanted to know more specifically who plays what roles within the advocacy within BCG. So are associates involved? What do they do? Are project leaders involved? What do they do? How do they all work together to make this advocacy happen, given the constraints of either hierarchy or time?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So the way we set it up, so on a global basis, the LGBT network, has a whole bunch of different functions, as you can imagine, from affiliation to recruiting to you name it. But from an advocacy standpoint, what we've done is we've set up a global network of what we call nodes. And so the idea behind a node is in every single office around the world, there is somebody who is the point person from an LGBT advocacy standpoint that plays a few different functions. So one is it's kind of social and affiliative, as you can imagine, so that they'll actually organize events to bring together the LGBT community and to connect the LGBT community to the office as a whole. But then they also connect with office management. So things like this office leadership training program we're rolling out for the transgender element. They will be the ones that help us coordinate that on the ground in each office. And I think what's neat about our nodes program is they are not necessarily senior people. We've actually been very intentional in trying to have those people be some of our more junior consultants. So the idea is that as you're comfortable in doing so, it's a chance to step forward and actually play a fairly significant office leadership role as kind of a member of the diversity leadership team in the local office. So it's kind of what I was talking to a little bit earlier, kind of pulls up really early on opportunities for you to build a really neat business skill set, to connect with leadership, to be kind of a key thought partner to office management, as well as to be part of the LGBT leadership team. In offices where we don't have LGBTers or the LGBTers in those offices don't feel comfortable playing that role, we actually have allies playing that role. And so that's how we create that web. And then that network of nodes, which is 60, 70 people strong now, actually connect into sort of a central infrastructure. So we have somebody who leads our nodes program globally. They run trainings, they have best practices sharing sessions, et cetera, et cetera. And so that helps integrate things together around the world. But that's really how we drive that advocacy kind of on the ground level day to day. And so, if an issue emerges on a case team in a local office, like that might be how that ultimately filters its way up. On top of that, when there are kind of the big picture problems or opportunities, that would be when our global leadership team, which is a group of 6 or 7 of us, step forward and help drive that. So for example, a couple weeks back, there was a whole host of companies that we all signed an amicus brief to the Supreme Court around gay marriage. It was that leadership group that basically got everyone together, got the CEO to sign off on it, and got that through. So we'll do some of that type of work more from a central group.
Got time for one more question, if there is one.
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how to encourage not just us, because we are affiliated as the LGBT co-leaderships, but rather our allies in their summer internships on being an advocate for our community, especially when the internships tend, they can convert to full-time offers, and so how they balance that prospect of a full-time offer versus being an advocate slash ally.
It's a great question. I mean, I think it's going to differ from kind of company to company to a pretty large extent. I mean, if I think about our own organization, you know, so as we look at our summer interns and we say, basically, do we want this person here, you know, in the long run? You know, there's a couple of different dimensions that we're looking at, right? So one of them is obviously going to be core performance in the job, and so you're on a case team. Do you have business sense? Do you contribute to getting to the outcome? And that's number one. But there's actually a second dimension there, which is very much around kind of your cultural fit and the citizenship role that you can play. And so, you know, I think a lot of interns tend to interpret that as I go to all of the intern cocktail hours and dinners and social events and stuff. But actually much, much more valuable is interns finding a way to connect with kind of the interstitial glue that keeps a company together. And in doing that as a summer intern, and whether it be, you know, connecting to a company's LGBT organization as an ally, or, you know, being part of a local office affiliation group, or being part of some sort of practice area group, or whatever it might be, actually committing the time to do that can be a really, really powerful way to demonstrate that you're committed to the organization, because you basically see the organization as a living, breathing thing that needs to grow, that needs to be nurtured, and that needs support from people who have passion to actually drive it forward in a positive way. And that's good. It also helps you extend that network of people that you're connected with, who will look at you and say, this is somebody who's a real valuable asset to us as a community. And so, you know, it kind of comes back to, again, you know, these roles that you play in these networks, whether you're an ally, whether you're an LGBTer, they're more than just promoting this cohort and the needs of this cohort. Yeah, they play a much broader role in helping organizations be good, diverse, functional, wonderful places to be. And so, you know, I think as you try to convince an ally to kind of get involved, there's a great piece there that's around, yes, you help advance, you know, the needs of the LGBT community, and that's wonderful. But from a more selfish lens, it's a way for them to actually really be able to say, you know, I want to see this be a successful culture and environment, and I'm invested in making that happen. And it's a really powerful complement to demonstrating just strong proficiency in the core skills over the summer.
Excellent. Well, please join me in thanking Gabby.
Thanks, guys.